Okay, good evening. Here we are, pajamaed up with our little comforters and ready to start thinking about sleep. So my name's Dr Chris Harvey and I work at the Sleep and Circadian Neuroscience Institute at the University of Oxford, and I'm here with my colleague Dr Anna-Marie Lauk. So my research focuses on sleep in adolescence, how we can use sleep education to improve sleep and the effect that might have on well-being and learning outcomes primarily. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your research, Anna-Marie?
Yes, sure. So my research focuses on therapies for insomnia, and then specifically on digital therapies for insomnia. So how we can help you sleep better with the help of the internet.
And how effective are those digital therapies?
So far, research suggests that they're similar effective to a face-to-face therapy. Face-to-face therapy is the therapy you just get at when you go to a psychologist or that you get in a group therapy. There is some idea that it might be slightly less effective, but still, 70% of the people seems to be helped by these digital therapies.
So, one thing I know about treating insomnia is that if you treat the insomnia, comorbid conditions are often also improved, particularly in things like depression, anxiety, alcoholism. Is there any data to suggest that the digital therapies might also have those kind of impacts?
Yeah, similar to any kind of insomnia therapy, no matter what modality you give it in, face-to-face or internet, it seems that there's positive effect of these therapies, for instance, for the mental health issues you mentioned, like depression and like anxiety, but also there's research that suggests it has a positive effect on things like tinnitus. So there's a broad range of effects that might be coming from this CBT for insomnia.
On tinnitus? That's really interesting. Do you have any idea why improving sleep might improve tinnitus?
It might have actually a lot to do with coping mechanisms in generally. So insomnia therapy teaches you how to cope with daily worries or handle maybe stressors better, which might have an effect. But it could be that the sleep has an effect as well. It's not completely clear yet.
What about the idea that improved sleep might just improve general resiliency, general psychological resiliency?
So we're still a bit on finding out that. It seems that sleep, indeed, improving your sleep just has a positive effect on your general mental well-being and your resiliency. At the moment, I'm actually running a study to see that if this CBT for insomnia, cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, we would say, if it's really the improved sleep that improves your well-being, or if it's more the general effects of this therapy. We're working on it right now.
That's really great. I didn't know about the tinnitus stuff. I think the digital stuff's really interesting. And one of the things that we get, or that I get asked a lot, is about wearable devices, the constant monitoring they'll have of their sleep now. What do you think of that from a public health stance, but also from a sleep treatment stance?
So on the one hand, like, everyone is now tracking their sleep, almost, it seems. Obviously, it's not everyone. But that gives a wealth of data, and it could give some indication of how people at the moment sleep around the world. But we also don't know really how good these measures are always for sleep. So, for instance, when you have one of those wristbands, we don't know exactly how well it predicts your sleep. Probably it can predict reasonably well if you're not sleeping or if you are sleeping, but it can't really say something about how deep you are sleeping. So for that, you would probably need more research. But in general, if we could work with these huge data sets that these companies have, that would be very interesting and possibly can help us with therapy as well.
Yeah, because the last data I saw on this basically said that the devices, the commercially available devices, the wearable devices, give really good estimates of broad sleep values. So how long you've slept for, how long it took you to fall asleep, and how long you're awake for during the night, so long as you're a good sleeper. But what it doesn't seem to be so good at is with people with disorders, and the sleep staging often was not as accurate in terms of your deep sleep or light sleep.
Yeah, I think definitely for sleep staging, like saying you're in REM sleep or in deep sleep, I don't think any of these measurements based on movement are ideal. We just submitted some research actually that shows that for this digital therapy, it doesn't really matter whether you keep your sleep by a pen and paper diary. Let's not call it a pen and pencil diary, or a wristband. The treatment has more or less the same effects, independent on how you keep your sleep. So it's probably just a matter of preference, right? What would you like? Probably that's the way to go.
Sure.
But yeah.
Sure, but then there's also, the idea of objective measures aren't always the gold standard, especially when you're working in something that's psychological, like insomnia.
So yeah, for diagnosis of insomnia, you don't have to, what we would call objective sleep disturbances, you don't have to have them if you have the subjective complaint. So if you feel it takes you too long to fall asleep, if you feel your sleep impairs you during the day, that's enough to diagnose the disorder. So it doesn't actually matter how bad you're sleeping. Obviously, a lot of people are sleeping badly at that point as well.
So actually, one of the essay questions we set on the postgraduate sleep course that we're running here at Oxford for this module was insomnia as a disorder of wakefulness. Discuss. Mm-hmm. So what's your take on that kind of question?
Well, with some changes in the field, it's definitely become more pronounced that we should take into account daytime effects, right? Because if you would be a bad sleeper, but you would be fine during the day, it would have no effects on you during the day, would you go look for help? Probably not. It's the effects on the daytime. So the reason that you can't do your studies that well anymore, your work is not as great as it should be, that is what drives you to get help, and probably not necessarily the sleep shortage in itself.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So the people that have insomnia that seek the help are the severest cases.
Well, potentially they have the most severe daytime effects.
Mm-hmm. But maybe not the most severe sleep disruption, actually.
We don't know, because there's probably a difference in vulnerability or how people handle sleep as well. Like, not everyone needs the same amount of sleep. It might be very well.
Yeah, because then if you compare that to something like obstructive sleep apnea, where the question might be, this might be the other way around, where a lot of people go to the GP for help because they feel fatigued, because they feel tired, but they're completely unaware that their sleep is being constantly disrupted. But it's actually the daytime consequences of sleep loss that drive them to their GP.
Yeah. So, in a way, it's similar, right? It's the sleepiness that drives you, and not necessarily drives you for... but even for sleep apnea, actually, some people are driven by sleepiness to their GP. Mm-hmm. Some people are only going to their GP because their wife or their partner or whoever says, you are snoring so loudly and you're doing really scary things during your sleep. And then once they start their treatment...
you mean stop breathing.
Stop breathing. Which is a very scary thing to do during your sleep. I meant stop breathing. Thank you for the clarification.
Well, because there are other disorders where you might start hitting people or whatever.
Oh, yeah, for sure. They're very... you can do a lot of scary things in your sleep, but let's hope we don't do them all. A lot of people actually, once they get treated for their sleep apnea, then they realize that, oh, I was sleepy before. I didn't really realize that, but now that I know how I'm supposed to be, now I'm actually realizing it's sleepy. So sometimes you can have a sleep disorder without really being aware of it yourself, which is another scary thing, but let's not do all the scary things just before bedtime, because that's not helping either,
It's not part of the wind down period. So obviously, working as sleep researchers, quite often, if you're at the pub, if you're out, it becomes a clinic. You don't always like telling people you work in sleep research because you become a sleep therapist. But what is the question you get asked most often by people when they find out you research sleep?
Well, definitely the question is, I sleep this and this many hours. Is that enough? Should I get more? Should I get less? And then I always have to say, well, I can't really say, I can't really give an answer. It's different per person. But if you feel good about it, if you perform normally in your life and you don't really notice any daytime effects, then probably it's fine. I'm not going to give them 100% guarantee, but probably that's the case. But you must get questions like that all the time as well.
Yeah, so I get that a lot. How much sleep do I need? It's fairly common. And my response always is, it varies. Everyone's sleep need varies. So some people need 6, and that's all they need, but some people need 10, and that's what they need. And so there's no right amount. The average, the healthy average, is between 6 to 8, but there's no set amount. It depends on your lifestyle, your genetics, your stage of life. Different ages sleep differently. There's a whole load of stuff involved in that. But actually, this just made me one question I had about the devices, and thinking about it from a sort of professional public health status. Do you think there's a danger that if people are so constantly monitoring their sleep and the wearable devices aren't 100% potentially, that could then induce an insomnia-like disorder?
It could be. I don't know that yet. To be fair, probably the older devices are not long enough around to see really if they're gonna give us this huge shortage of sleep epidemic. But definitely, obviously, if you're focusing too much on something, it can be a problem. If you're constantly saying, I should not eat fries, not eat fries, not eat fries, like you gonna want to eat these fries. So if you're focusing constantly on sleep, or if you're even focusing on sleep, oh, I don't sleep enough, I don't sleep enough, I don't sleep enough, that's not going to help you fall asleep at night. So there might be a potential danger. On the other hand, it might be a comforter for some people, thinking that they think I only sleep 3 hours a night, and then they look at these device data and they say, oh, well, my device says I sleep 7, I am fine, irrespective of whether that data is correct. So we don't know yet which way it's gonna end up, I would say. But
I think that would be some really interesting data for the field, because sleep's an automatic process. So the more you focus on it, the harder it becomes, right? Like any other automatic process. If you focus too much on your breathing, you'll have a panic attack. If you focus too much on your sleeping, you'll develop insomnia. But we are actually now starting to do some work on this positive, false, negative, false feedback, and seeing what effect that has on responsive therapy. So that would be really good, especially to tie it up with this big data stuff.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see what we can do basically extra to promote good sleep and get rid of the stuff that promotes bad sleep, pretty much. So like sitting in a bed with laptops and technology, probably not the best. We've all heard that.
With a colleague.
With a colleague, probably also not the best, unless you have a really nice colleague. But,
exactly. Or you want a promotion.
Yes, I do.
Yeah. So for you, in terms of your research, what's the next big question for the field? What's the next big frontier for sleep research?
So I think this digital part will be interesting for sleep as well. The whole world is changing, right? We use more devices, we use more of internet, we use more of a laptop. So it's going to be interesting how this changing world has an effect on our sleep. We see that probably, like just our that we see so much more blue light, but also sitting indoors is with less light is during the day is also not helping our sleep. So there's so many changes going on in our society that I think that will be really interesting to see how that is going to affect sleep at a scale, and I think it will affect it. Probably I'm judged like prejudiced because I'm a sleep researcher, so obviously I think everything like the world circles around sleep, right? I'm probably very biased, but I think that will be an area that will be more also performance-wise. I think there's more and more realization that we need sleep to perform well, and that's for us, for normal people to perform well at their jobs, but it's also people in shift work, people doing complicated operations, police officers in the middle of the night deciding on whether to shoot or not. So there's a lot of things going on in that field as well, which I think are going to become more and more important as well.
Yeah, there was a paper I saw in the media this morning, so I haven't read the actual science, so this is really bad science communication right now, but there's a paper in the media saying that judges hand out more severe sentences on a Monday morning compared to the rest of the week, and I assume that that's got something to do with social jet lag. So social jet lag being the idea that you sleep in at the weekend to make up for the sleep that you've lost during the week, but then come Monday morning you're really sleep deprived again because you've had to cut the sleep short once again on the Monday, and that obviously affects your mood, your irritability, and potentially even your empathy, which is perhaps why judges might hand out more severe sentences.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like it can affect a lot of stuff, but we don't always know. Obviously, it's possible that it's not as big as a topic as we think, hope.
Yeah, there's a sleep education thing in Montreal called Sleeping for Success, and I really wish that we got there first with that name.
It would be, yes. We can maybe steal it for this one.
We have some questions.
Sure, we'll take some questions.
Well, so we've got a question here about whether the study of sleep is for brain science or whether it's more for psychology. I think is what they're asking.
Okay, so whether the study of sleep is a psychological problem or a brain neuroscience problem.
So I would not necessarily say that neurological are that different from psychological problems in itself, because a lot of psychological problems originate in the brain as well. So I'm struggling a bit always to make that distinction really clear cut. I think it's both. So yeah, there's probably going to be more neurology based issues that can make a person sleep worse. But obviously there's psychological things such as worries, which are really bad for your sleep as well.
Yeah, cause we had another question, is why do I have to think about everything that's annoying me before I sleep?
Yes, and that's very common, right? People just start thinking about things and it becomes like this whole train of thoughts. People with issues with that, we would advise them to keep a little diary next to the bed with a pen and write them up and think like, oh, I've written them up so I can think about it tomorrow and I don't have to worry about today.
Yeah, so another way we approach that is we would say to people to have a worry chair where they would go sit in this chair, and it's a space where they'd sit and write about their worries, what they're concerned about, what they're, what's happening the next day, and write out a plan for how they're going to deal with it, so that if it does come back into their head in the night, they can think, no, I've planned for that, it'll be fine. And that's part of some of the cognitive psychological approaches that we might take to something like insomnia. But it's really hard to separate these two things out, because obviously we have this psychological intervention that you're working on quite extensively right now, and that's successful, it works, it's the first line treatment for something like insomnia. But sleep is such a massively complex process. It involves so many different neuronal systems that, of course, it is both psychological and neurological, like almost everything. But it does mean that the treatment for different sleep disorders will probably have different elements of both affecting neural substrates, but also targeting specifically psychological patterns and behaviours.
And is anxiety, would you treat anxiety differently from, say, depression? If depression is getting in the way of sleep? Is there someone asking about what to do there?
Well, obviously all these depression, anxiety and insomnia have specific treatments, but it is shown that if you treat one, often the other one improves a bit as well. And there's been a paper out not too long ago that actually showed that if you're treating insomnia, the depression was more relieved than if you would comparable to when you would treat depression than the insomnia improvement. So there's obviously, because they tap on similar constructs, you can treat one and the other one is likely to improve. What you treat first is part of obviously the clinical person, the clinical professional deciding what is treated now, but it can sometimes also be a patient preference, right? For some people it can be much less daunting to talk about their sleep and to address their sleep than, for instance, if they have a post-traumatic stress disorder and they have to talk about their trauma. That's a really daunting thing, so sometimes sleep can be a way in as well for treatment.
Yeah, sometimes we talk about sleep as a kind of gateway to help disorder, because it's much easier for people to talk about having a sleep disorder that's much more normalised. I mean, in the UK it's almost like the weather, people come in and talk about how badly they slept the night before and how terrible the rain is, and it's really easy, whereas saying, oh, I wasn't at work last week because I was so depressed, people don't usually say that, and if they do say that, they're not always taking that seriously anyway, because people misuse sadness instead of depression. But yeah, it's really interesting. It's interesting how professionally that attitude has changed. Because it used to be you would get diagnosed with insomnia comorbid to depression or insomnia comorbid to anxiety. So the main disorder, depression or anxiety, would be treated, and the expectation would be that the insomnia would remit. Now, insomnia is a diagnosis in its own right. So if you have insomnia and depression, you have two separate disorders, and so should technically receive two separate courses of treatment for each disorder. But that's a very recent change in how professionals are working with it now, and that's really encouraging.
And what would you encourage people to do as your kind of top tips of trying to wind down before bed? I mean, would you stop drinking caffeine at a certain time? Would you stop watching TV and using your phone? What would your kind of top tips be as winding down for bedtime? So
I guess the top tips are kind of, in terms of the wind down stuff, are maybe a bit, they're quite straightforward. So we would recommend having a 90-minute wind down window where you have a set routine. You brush your teeth, you wash your face, you get into your lovely onesie, and you engage in relaxing activities. So maybe you drink a cup of herbal tea, maybe you read a book, maybe you use this time to, for example, do your worry list, if that's something that is helping you, relaxation techniques, avoiding very bright light, because that upregulates the system. And avoiding anything that's going to be an arouser. So we would say, you know, not having laptops in the room, not having phones in the room, not just because of the blue light, because the data on that's, the jury's out on that really, but the things you engage in with these devices is in and of themselves arousing, and will lead to cognitive arousal, if not physiological. So it's about creating a space for sleep. Although that being said, I think it's fair to say that if you don't have trouble sleeping, a lot of these rules don't really matter. If your sleep system's robust, it's difficult to affect it with these things. But if your sleep system is a bit weaker, or not as resilient, then those are the kind of top tips I think we would usually give out to people.
Yeah, for sure. And I definitely think the arousing part is really important. Don't start playing video games or anything that gets you all excited, because that is definitely not helping at all. So anything that makes you calm, but also definitely a routine with similar things every time will make your body aware of what's gonna happen. So yeah, I would completely agree. And obviously there's the stuff probably everyone knows, caffeine, probably not right before bed or in the evening. Also very rigorous exercise, don't do it right before bed, so don't go running at 10 if you plan to go sleep at 11, because that's probably not the wisest. Well, during the day, very good thing, so exercise until the early evening, definitely generally helping your sleep.
Exercising outside as much as you can as well, getting as much bright light during the day will help keep your internal clock to the right time, so you sleep at the right time in the evening.
And then there's obviously the one that no one wants to hear: be careful with your alcohol, because a lot of alcohol is not going to help you sleep either. It will help you probably fall asleep, but you'll wake up much more during the night, so your sleep gets much more fragmented. So in the end, it's not as good as you would have hoped.
Yeah. Yeah.
Teenagers.
What about teenagers and their sleep? So teenagers' sleep system is actually much more vulnerable than a fully developed adult's system. They're more vulnerable to the effects of blue light. So that aspect of device use might be more important there, that they actually take a break from blue light in the evening. But what happens to adolescents is that they need more sleep, so their sleep need increases. We spoke about that right back at the start. Everyone has a different sleep need. For adolescents, that's longer. Obviously to account for all the developmental changes that are happening. But also their timing changes, their internal body clock changes. So we all have this system, or circadian rhythms, that control the timing of every aspect of behaviour and physiology. In adolescence, that clock gets delayed, which means that things start to happen later and later. So they are physiologically prepared for sleep later in the evening, they therefore need to sleep in much later in the morning, and this means that they're chronically sleep deprived, losing about 2 hours sleep a night, which could have potentially massive effects. In the short time, we know that sleep deprivation leaves you feeling tired, irritable, unable to concentrate. It also makes you more impulsive. It also makes it more difficult to read social cues accurately. But in the long term, sleep disruption or sleep deprivation is associated with weight gain, with cardiovascular disease, with things like diabetes, and over the very long term associated with things like depression, cancer, anxiety. And so it's really important, I think, that we try and preserve the sleep of adolescents as much as possible, because it's a very vulnerable time developmentally, and sleep is maybe a really easy way to help reduce mental health burden later. If we can protect sleep during this vulnerable period, does that then improve mental health outcomes in early adulthood? And I would hypothesize that it would.
And it's also, so most people will realize this as well, right? Oh, the teenager that lays in bed till 3 p.m. in the weekend, and we see that shift during our lives as well, right? As a kid, we're bright up at like 6 a.m. screaming at our mothers or fathers or whoever is there bed. Well, actually, that progressively gets later. You will never see a 17-year-old yelling at his parents' bed at 7 a.m. or it's much less unlikely. And then after adolescence, so probably in like beginning 20s, it's going to get earlier again. So although most people have a preference for being a morning person or an evening person, it does shift a bit during your life as well. So that's something that definitely is seen as well. And recognized, I would say, by most people, but let us know if not.
Yeah. What's your preference?
I am really average, so I'm not really a morning person. I'm not a real evening person, which I think is great because that means I can shift a bit to the beginning, and if I need to get up early for whatever, a flight or whatever. But I can also shift late when there's a really nice gig. So I'm definitely in the middle, which I think is ideal. But you're a very different type, I know, and you might feel that is much better. So maybe you should promote the late types now.
Yeah, no, I'm definitely a late type. I would much rather stay up until 2 or 3 and sleep until, well, late into the day. But luckily, I've got the kind of job where I can dictate my own time. So I'll start work at 10, I'll usually finish between 6 or 7, and I've got a career that facilitates that. But if you're a late type and you can't have that kind of career, you end up pretty exhausted most of the time. And actually a lot of late types, they'll seek help for insomnia because, again, what they're experiencing is the daytime effects of sleep loss, and that's what drives them to seek help. But actually what they have is maybe something more like a circadian rhythm disorder. But late types get a really bad rep.
But they are more creative, right? Is the idea.
That's right. My artistic temperament.
See, I'm finding the positive in here. I'm not sure what the average person, what their positive is going to be. But yes, and morning types, I think, are said to be generally, well, obviously they struggle a bit with social events sometimes, right? Because they kind of want to be in bed by 9 or 10. And that's not really, if you would like to go to that concert, it's probably not going to happen.
So they have less friends but are more likely to get a promotion.
Yes, because they pretty much. So
we don't have data for that. That was illustrative.
This was a very I did not say that. That was Dr. Chris Harvey.
Okay. Do you have any final comments or insights?
Well, my final comment would be sleep well all, but that seems maybe a bit quick. But yes, the key about sleep is basically not to worry about sleep, which is obviously a really hard thing to do. If you're not sleeping well, you're going to worry about it. A good sleeper won't worry about his sleep. So yeah, I think one of the keys to good sleeping is not thinking about your sleep, which, although I think about sleep daily, the full day, I'm quite lucky that I'm still a good sleeper.
But not your own sleep, right? You're thinking about other people's.
Yeah, so your own sleep. Yeah, so basically if you start thinking about sleep, make sure it's the sleep of your neighbour, your partner, or someone else. That might help. That, again, is...
Your dog. Excellent. Well, I guess before we go, I would like to summarise by saying why it matters, why we actually research sleep, and what it is we want to do. And really, the reason that we research sleep is because sleep impacts on every aspect of human experience. From actual experiential experiences, how we process sensory information, through to the immune system, through to mental health, through to physical health, through to social interactions. There's no aspect of our life that isn't affected by sleep. But it's an issue that affects a massive proportion of the population. For example, 10% of people have insomnia at any given time. But it also is fixable. And so it seems like the kind of, like an obvious target, particularly in psychological and wellbeing research. And that's why we do what we do. So I guess that's us for the evening. Time to turn off the lamps and get a good 6 to 8